It was a Thursday night at 9 o'clock, which is kind of late in the evening. We received a phone call from Angus Duncan, who worked in the mayor's office, and he said, would you consider having the president spend the night at your house?
Janet Olson isn't talking about President Joe Biden or former President Donald Trump. She's remembering an extraordinary time back in the spring of 1978 when this guy from the mayor's office called to ask her and her husband, Paul, what they thought about letting then-President Jimmy Carter stay at their house in Portland, Oregon.
You know, of course, we were a bit shocked by this question, but we said,
not going to happen.
Sure, you know, the likelihood of us being chosen seemed very small.
Their contact at the mayor's office had let them know that they were on a list of a few different people being considered for the presidential sleepover. The next day, the mayor's staffer, along with some people from the White House, rang their doorbell and asked to walk through the house. A few days later, one of the White House staffers came back.
And he said, my president has asked me to ask you if he could spend the night at your house. And so that's how it happened.
From the Gert Boyle studio at OPB, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Can you imagine someone showing up at your door and asking if the President of the United States could stay with you? Yeah, me neither. Apparently, Jimmy Carter did this at least 8 times during his presidency, and only once in Oregon. Freelance producer Nora Colie grew up down the street from Janet and Paul Olson, and she has some very distinct memories of that time in 1978 when the president came to visit Portland. Nora, first of all, how old were you at the time?
Well, I was 6 years old, and my best friend Kristen was 5. And it was Kristen's family was the family chosen to host the president. And I remember it was really exciting. I guess President Carter did this sometimes when he traveled. He liked to connect with people in their homes.
And do you have a sense for why the Olson family was selected to host the president when he came to Portland?
It's really hard to say for sure. From what I've learned, the White House asked the mayor to compile a list of people. And the Olsons worked on Democratic campaigns and the mayor's campaign, so they did have a connection in that way. And at the time, Paul Olson was running the conservation department at Nora Colie, which is a home remodeling company in Portland. And he was really focused on solar power, and the Olsons, in fact, had a solar hot water heater themselves. And that might have appealed to President Carter because he was very interested in renewable energy and solar power, and he actually installed solar panels on the White House. Unfortunately, later they were removed by the Reagan administration. It could also have been because we were living in the Irvington neighborhood, which was going through a transformation at the time. The houses there were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it was an affluent neighborhood. But by the time World War II came, most of the houses had been subdivided or turned into boarding homes to house the many people coming from around the country who moved to the area as part of the war workforce, and so they needed affordable housing. And after the war, it remained that way for a while. Lots of college kids lived in the area and veterans who had returned from the war. And the press called the Olson's house a rambling 3-story house where long-haired college dropouts once boarded. But by the late 60s and 70s, with the help of federal funds, the neighborhood started transforming back to single-family homes, and it became a showcase of urban renewal for the city. That could have been another reason why the Olsons were chosen, in particular because the city wanted to show off this renewal. Our street was exceptional because almost every house had kids in it. And so we were always running around through the streets into each other's homes as if they were our own. And Kristen and I actually talked about it when I met with her recently to reminisce about all of this.
People had each other's house keys, so if you got locked out of your house, you could go down the street. I mean, it just seems like It was that almost like you would picture a small town where everybody knows each other and you're comfortable with everybody because all the backyards were connected. You could run from backyard to backyard, and late in the evening, we were out playing and you didn't think twice about it.
But why would a president go through all the effort involved in staying in someone's home? To get some insight into that, we called up Dot Padgett.
Well, my name is Dot Padgett. I've been a friend of Jimmy Carter since 1970. I actually was just a citizen working in my yard one day thinking, what will I tell my grandchildren I've ever done with my life? And a car drove up. This was in 1970. A young man stepped out of the car, and it was Jimmy Carter from Plains, Georgia, and he was running for governor of Georgia. And he asked me if I would volunteer in his campaign for governor, which I did.
Dot had been recommended as a hard worker by one of Carter's advisors, who was friends with her and her husband. And she was. After working on his campaign for Georgia governor, she went on to work for Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign. She was a leader in what became known as the Peanut Brigade. This was a grassroots group of hundreds of volunteers from Georgia who worked to get Carter elected.
A plane of Georgians flew into New Hampshire. We campaigned and knocked on doors, talked to people, and he won the New Hampshire primary. And so from then on, I began to recruit and organize people, and we traveled all over the country.
According to Dot, the idea of staying in people's homes started during the campaign as a practical way to save money with limited funds available to presidential candidates at the time.
One of the reasons it was a necessity, there was so little money in that campaign.
After the Watergate scandal, Congress put some new restrictions on federal funding for presidential candidates. They could receive a certain amount as long as they didn't raise private money and stuck to strict spending limits.
During the general election, the campaign itself could not spend over the allotted amount of money. And so this just made sense. In addition to that, Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter liked people. It was important for them to get to know a family, to get to know their business, and it just worked in different ways for them.
Once he was president, the idea of staying with regular people when he traveled was no longer practical. But he did keep doing it. In addition to the Olsons, President Carter stayed with other families around the country during the time he was in office.
And I believe when I look at the list, it's geographically, there's a lot of diversity. Oklahoma, Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon.
He also stayed with families in Illinois, Iowa, Mississippi, and California. Dot went on to work in the Office of Protocol at the State Department, and she knows firsthand that it is very easy to lose touch with the world outside of politics when you spend the majority of your time in the nation's capital. She thinks that's one of the reasons that President Carter wanted to continue doing home visits.
His curiosity about people, his love of people, his desire to find out what is going on in a person's life and what he as a president can do. And I think it goes back to the fact that he wanted to know what people in the country actually were feeling and what they were thinking.
Nora, I imagine there are a lot of logistics involved in a presidential visit. You spoke with Janet and Paul Olson recently. What did they say about what that was like?
They had a lot to say about it, actually. They had new phones installed in their homes so that they could be connected directly to the White House switchboard. And they actually still have those phones. They no longer go directly to the White House, but they're kind of like relics in the house.
Yeah.
And the Secret Service showed up even before the Olsons were chosen to assess the area and grounds.
It's quite an involved process to visit all these homes and get all the security situation correct and involve the Secret Service and involve the neighborhood and, make sure that everybody's on the up and up. So it's a process that takes a lot of time with just the right people. But one of the nice things about President Carter is he had a great staff who, instead of saying this is how we want it, they always said, how can we help you through this process?
And what was it like for your family and the rest of the neighborhood?
Well, it's kind of funny. It was the 70s, and my family had 6 kids, and we were hippies. We ran around shirtless and barefoot, and we didn't cut our grass. So our grass looked more like a meadow than a lawn. And in today's Irvington neighborhood, the people there would go bonkers if our yard was, looking like a meadow. You'd probably get neighbors on next door complaining and a citation from the city. But at the time, it could be kind of a normal thing for a 70s neighborhood with boarding houses to have this high grass. And before Carter came, a few days before, the Secret Service knocked on our door and asked my parents to cut the grass. And my parents said no.
Oh my gosh.
My parents were politically active people. They were Reed graduates. And America had just come out of the Vietnam War and Watergate. So they had a lot of skepticism about the U.S. government.
Yeah.
My parents didn't want the government telling them what to do, so I'm sure they said no strictly in defiance. But I'm also sure my parents had voted for Jimmy Carter.
Right.
But a day or so later, my parents came home from work and the grass was cut.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. So how did they react?
They were so mad.
I bet. And why do you think that happened? Why did it matter?
I mean, maybe it was about looks, or maybe it also was a security risk. Years before, my sister's pet turtle got lost in that high grass, and he was lost for 6 months to a year. We ended up finding him alive, which was great. But I guess a person could have hidden in that grass if they really wanted to.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
The Secret Service just took over. They ended up also parking their car in our driveway, and you just had to let them.
What was the vibe like as it got closer to the president's visit?
Well, it started to become really hard to maneuver around the neighborhood. My house was 2 doors down from the Olsons, but in order for me to leave my house and join the crowd to observe the Olsons' house, I had to walk down the street, get frisked by the Secret Service at the end of the street to make sure I wasn't carrying any weapons on my 6-year-old body, and then cross the street and walk back up the street to the designated area for crowds. And the crowd started showing up a day or two before the president even arrived. There was food, there was music. The Blazers were huge at the time. The year before, they had won the championship. And I think Bill Walton and Maurice Lucas showed up. And the crowds went bonkers.
Oh, yeah.
Those guys were basically more popular than the president.
I mean, right.
And then there were protesters.
Oh, interesting. What were they protesting?
They were anti-nuclear protesters. I guess when a president comes to Portland, they should always expect some kind of protest.
Yep.
According to one of the neighbors, Marilyn Fleming, who lived and still lives across the street from the Olsons, she told me the protesters showed up and politely asked to stand in front of her house with their signs protesting nuclear weapons and energy. And honestly, I think almost anyone that showed up to greet the president probably agreed with them. So it wasn't like it would be today where people would get mad at protesters. The protesters were like a fixture in the excitement. And Marilyn told them, of course, they could stand in front of her house. But what she didn't tell them is the guy with the nuclear codes was staying in her house.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, while most Carter staff would be sleeping at hotels, the guy with the codes needed to sleep very near the president, and so he got a bed over at the Fleming's house.
Oh my gosh, what an incredible coincidence. So what was it like when the president finally arrived on your street?
So yeah, it was May 4th when he arrived, and he touched down in Portland around 5 p.m. and then went and held a press conference and met VIPs at the Hilton Hotel before finally arriving on our street and to the Olsons around 9 p.m. And this was Thursday night. The street was lined with press and police officers and people who wanted to just get a glimpse of him. And the Olsons were waiting on the porch, Janet, Paul, along with Kristen and her little brother Aaron, who was then 3 years old.
Well, first of all, a motorcade arrives. About 10 or 15 cars and motorcycles line up on the street.
It was dark, but there were, of course, lights from all the press and everything. And then all of a sudden, yeah, like Paul said, the motorcade comes down the street. And then it's like, oh, wow, this is happening, you know? So that was, I remember that moment very clearly. About how I felt. I don't know about you, but
pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It was just amazing.
Yeah, it was
because it was an event.
It was very exciting. You know, this is a very powerful man who's, you know, coming into your simple big home, but yeah, it was a very moving time. I've compared it to, you know, those big events that happen in your life, you know, when you get married, your children are born. You know, that was right up there with a very, very special moment in my life.
Coming up after a break, we'll hear what it was like when the president actually went inside the Olsons' home to spend the evening with them. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and you will be able to wake up on Monday morning, not with the president, but with a new podcast episode to listen to that week. You can also follow OPB at OPB Photo on Instagram, and we'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen and the rest of our friends at OPB are up to. And remember, this episode about President Jimmy Carter's visit to Portland and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show all the time is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. From presidential elections to presidential sleepovers, our political coverage and so much more is powered by you. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. Okay, so before the break, we heard what happened when President Carter arrived in the Portland neighborhood where Nora and the Olsons lived. But Nora, what happened after that? Did they just go inside?
Well, Jimmy got out of the car and waved at the cheering crowd, and they were chanting his name, Carter, Carter. And he worked his way up the steps of their staircase. They have a long staircase, and he seemed to be carrying his own suitcase. Kristen, who was age 5 at the time, was wearing her pink party dress, and Janet said she liked to twirl in that dress. So once the president got to the porch, she did a little twirl for him. And then the president just picked her up and greeted her, and she seemed really comfortable with him right away. I didn't remember any of this, but I found doing this story all these articles emphasizing the bond between Kristen and the president. And like me, when we were kids, she was always kind of a shy person. So that was pretty remarkable for me to see the photos and old news footage as she looked really comfortable and relaxed with him. And I was watching old footage today, in fact, on YouTube of her meeting him. And there's such a sweet exchange between them. It's really cute. And so, yeah, they all said hello, introduced themselves, and off they went inside the house.
We were directed to sit on this couch, which is over there, and all the press kind of stormed in and gathered on each other's shoulders, practically, in the entry area. And this was all at the direction of the White House. They orchestrated that whole entrance process. And then there were a couple of questions from the press. And so there was this process of questioning and answering by the press. And then at some point, somebody from the White House said, okay, well, that's it. We're done.
So at that point, after the press was directed to leave, was the Olson family actually alone with the president?
Well, sort of. Jimmy's executive assistant stayed, but kind of melted into the walls. The Secret Service left with the press, but they were stationed right outside and around the house. One guy on the roof next door Bright lights were staged outside the house, keeping it all lit up in the dark so that they could look out for any sort of danger.
All of a sudden, here we are with the president. But immediately you could just see him relaxing. He took off his tie, his coat. He eventually took his shoes off. But we were just sitting with him, and the kids were coloring and drawing. I mean, it was 9:30. It was really past their bedtime. Aaron, our 3-year-old, had saved him a glass of half a glass of 7-Up that he had drank partly of. He had been saving it all day and offered it to the president. We had prepared some food because generally we were told he really doesn't eat at these formal dinners, just kind of casual food. I made my mother's rhubarb custard pie. We had some local smoked salmon that somebody in the neighborhood had caught. We had some Oregon wine, but I went out into the kitchen. He came out with me and visited, and I had a collection of old canning jars, and we talked about canning jars and cooking and just simple conversation like you would have with any old friend who's in your kitchen. He was just easy, real easy to be around.
Rhubarb custard pie was delicious. And I'm sure he loved it.
Wow. So I guess he was kind of a regular house guest at that point.
Yeah, and I guess the next thing that happened is he read the children a bedtime story because they were up way past their bedtime. So he offered to read to them.
And so we have these wonderful pictures of him lying on our bed with our kids. Kristen was sitting in front of him. Aaron, a 3-year-old, was kind of jumping around a little bit on the bed, but Kristen chose the book, which was The Emperor's New Clothes. He read it, and he just lied on the bed, just like any dad would do with their kids, and read to them. So that was very, very special.
Do the kids remember this? They were pretty young at the time, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure Aaron would know because he was only 3, but Kristen told me she doesn't have a lot of strong memories of the visit. She said that she remembers being upset that the president's executive assistant was given her room to sleep in and she had to go sleep in her brother's room. And as I said earlier, at the time the press made a big deal about the connection between Kristen and Jimmy Carter. She told me she always had warm feelings towards him, and the fact that he stayed in her house, it's just a fun fact she gets to talk about at dinner parties and stuff.
It is kind of surreal when you really, really think about it. But to me, partly it's just like, yeah, the president stayed in my house. When I was teaching, they would ask us, like for teacher orientation, what's something that people don't know about you? And I could say, well, the president stayed at my house. Not everyone gets to say that. But to me, sometimes it's just this casual comment, But I just feel like because of him staying here, he's kind of family.
So once the kids were in bed, did Paul and Janet just hang out with the president for a while?
They lit a fire for him in the primary bedroom where Jimmy was sleeping, and Paul and Janet took to the guest room. But yeah, for a little bit while longer, they chatted.
He asked me a couple of questions. This is your chance to say something to somebody who can have an impact on what you do, and which is the solar energy issue and the energy conservation, which was a parallel topic to the solar. And I just expressed to him that I was pleased with what was going on in his administration about the emphasis on conservation. And, when you're in that situation, I hadn't given a lot of thought to any of the questions that he might ask. I didn't prepare anything, so you're a little bit tongue-tied.
Well, I think we also felt like, he's in political situations all day, and this was a chance for him to relax and be with the family. And so we really had kind of decided, to not get into a lot of political pressure. We also didn't have all that much time. I mean, he was tired, long day, and so he was really ready to retire.
Okay, so what was it like the next morning?
Well, he seemed to keep a bit to his daily routine, which was reading the morning White House news summary, which was important news on the presidency and things happening around the country and the world. The Olsons still have that summary signed by the president, tucked into one of their really beautifully preserved scrapbooks. I guess I did have a little bit of quiet time with him in the morning.
He didn't want us to prepare any breakfast. I could have made him an omelet.
President Carter skipping breakfast would not have surprised longtime friend of the Carter family, Dot Paget.
Jimmy and Rosa both had not strict diets, but they ate very healthy. And so there was no big breakfast prepared for them the next morning. And more than likely, Jimmy got up and left a note or something and probably left before they might even have gotten up. I'm assuming that was a practice that would not surprise me at all.
Maybe when he was still a candidate, he could have gotten up early, written a note, and slipped out the door. But once he was president, that was no longer an option. Before leaving the Olsons' home, he did write Kristen's teacher a note to excuse her from class because she didn't go to preschool that day.
We took a cup of coffee up to him because he reads in the morning. I mean, he took a shower and had a cup of coffee and did some reading. And then he came down and just visited with us for a few minutes.
Just briefly.
By that time, of course, all the neighbors were in the street. The mayor was here, the press. And so once he stepped out the door, he belonged back to the public.
But for that brief time, he could kind of relax and not be a public figure, just a guy having coffee. Nora, what happened after he left?
He went to meetings he had come to Portland to go to because, of course, he wasn't just here to stay at the Olsons' house. He came for a meeting with leaders from Western states and to talk about a range of topics.
So he just stayed the one night, right?
Yes.
And what was it like after the crowd dispersed? I imagine it took a while for things to go back to normal on your street.
Yes, it did. That whole phone prepping to wire calls directly to the White House made it so I couldn't call the Olsons to ask Kristen if she wanted to play, as their phone wasn't receiving incoming phone calls. So that seemed to be a case for a while, or I remember it seemed like it lasted a really long time after the president's visit. And I remember I found it really annoying that I had to walk 2 houses up from mine and ring the bell every time I wanted to see if Kristen could play. So I guess phones were just as important to kids in the 70s as they are now. But the president did keep in touch with the Olsons. He sent them a really nice handwritten thank you note and even invited them to the White House.
It went on for actually quite a long time. We were invited to speak at different functions. Paul was invited to speak to different business groups. Yeah. We continued. We were asked to write for the press our experience, and that ended up being printed all over the country. And I mean, we have clippings that people sent us from everywhere. I mean, that was the other thing that was really moving. We got letters from people. I mean, it wasn't, well, why you and not me? It was everybody feeling really good about the fact that, wow, you had this wonderful experience. And wasn't it wonderful? But we have all these letters from people that we didn't know, people asking me for the recipe for the rhubarb custard pie. And so there was a chef who had a cooking column. He asked me for the recipe, so could he publish the recipe for the rhubarb pie that we had served to President Carter? So it was just, this kind of went on for probably well into the summer.
And did they go to the White House?
Yes, they did visit the White House with the kids. By that time, they were 3 kids because Janet was pregnant at the time of Carter's visit to Portland. And Kristen did have a really specific memory of the trip.
I do remember sitting in the movie theater at the White House. So I don't know what movie we watched or what we did, but I can kind of visualize us just sitting there. But I still have the dress that I wore there in the White House. So I still have that. I have my party dress when I met him, and then the White House dress that I have. But the biggest highlight was the movie theater.
Wow, I gotta say, if I was a young kid invited to the White House, that would be my biggest highlight too. Dot Paget says that Jimmy Carter once took a nap at her house, but she never hosted him or his wife for an overnight visit. She did travel with the campaign, though, and she could tell that the Carters appreciated how much their overnight visits meant to people.
When Rosalind and I had traveled together for a week, she ended up in my hometown, and she said, "Why don't I just spend the night with you?" And I said, "I don't know what stage my house is in. I haven't been home for a month, but I will ask my next door neighbor." And my next door neighbor was just delighted to have Rosalind spend the night with her. And on many occasions, and just recently, her daughter said, "You know, that was the highlight of my mother's life, was having Rosalind Carter spend the night in her home and then going to a party at the White House."
According to Dot, after Jimmy Carter was elected president, he and Rosalind had a party at the White House for all of the families that had hosted them during the campaign. Dot wanted to be sure that we knew Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were always very good house guests.
I do know that Rosalind and I stayed together in homes, and she was very considerate of people. She would take the little cleaning pads that you clean the makeup off your face, and she always had those in her little bag because she did not want to put some makeup on someone's linens, bath linens.
Nora, what do you think was the lasting impact of this extraordinary moment in time for the Olson family?
I think it's mainly the strong impression that he left on the family and those of us in the neighborhood, because it was such an unusual thing, and he had to really want to connect with individual American citizens in order to do that. I mean, that was a heavy lift to come here. And I think that speaks to who Jimmy Carter is.
I frankly think that this was one of the best things that he did, because it took him away from what was going on at the White House, from every moment that he was awake and something that he was having to take care of, and put him in another setting. I'm glad that you all are doing this and making a story out of it.
Dot Paget is the author of Jimmy Carter, Elected President with Pocket Change and Peanuts. Until recently, she served on the board of counselors for the Carter Center. She remains a friend of the Carter family. Well, Nora, I just think it's so cool that you have a personal connection like this to this really interesting history. Thank you so much for sharing all of it with us.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Nora Colie is a freelance producer. You can see the video she created for OPB and read her article about President Carter's visit to Portland at opb.org. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing. Nora Colie, Julie Sabatier, and Stephanie Gordon did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.
Actually, I celebrated my birthday recently, and I was 97 years old. And I still am very active. I drive my car 80 miles an hour in the fast lane, so don't get in front of me unless you're driving 80 miles an hour or I'll pass you.